Hello and welcome back, and that is right, it's time for another Before You Buy and Should You Buy, and today we're looking at this. This is Samsung's T9 external SSD. We've already done a full review on this that's hopefully already live. We went into some performance numbers, went into Samsung Magician and talked about what we liked and didn't like about the drive, but it ran a little long, didn't it? So today we're going to give you 4 reasons why you should consider this drive for your next storage drive for backups or editing on the fly, and 4 reasons why you might want to sit on the fence a little bit longer. So without further ado, let's crack on with number 1. Straight away, the first one, it is absolutely tiny. Look at the size of this. This is a 4TB external drive that will comfortably fit inside your pocket. To put that into perspective, here is my wallet, and right there you can see this is smaller than the wallet that I carry in my pocket. On top of that, it's smaller than the phone I carry in my pocket. That is how tiny this is. And this 4TB drive not only arrives with kind of silicon rubber external coating that's actually pretty sweet to look at, but also with heat dissipation working inside, with phased transition material in that metal to allow dissipation from the internal PCB and the NAND on board to easily alleviate heat into the air. But on top of that, the drive can survive a 3-meter drop. And again, Samsung did a bunch of tests showing people about that. And alongside all of that, when you are using the drive, it doesn't actually get that hot, which really surprised me when we were utilizing this drive for a lot of our testing in the background, and it wasn't going nuts. It was remaining at a standard kind of easygoing temperature, and even Samsung's Magician software didn't really complain about it when we were using it. So overall, that combined with the build quality, the scale of the device arriving at just 122 grams at the 1, 2 and the 4TB, and arriving with 5 years of manufacturer's warranty, just means to me that this is a very well put together drive. Next up, let's talk a little bit about that performance there, and one of the things that really stands out for this drive is Samsung's TurboWrite. Now, the assistance towards something called over-provisioning, or OP, on SSDs is hardly new. It is when you take an area of storage inside the drive, and this ends up working as write cache for the drive over time, and overall it improves performance, either normal performance of just what you're getting for your read and write, but also sustained performance over time. SSDs, unlike hard drives, when they make these big bold claims about what the performance those drives can hit, again this is talking Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5 SSDs, one of the things that they often go and not really talk about much afterwards is sustained performance, because of something called oversaturation of the SSD's controller and cache and the memory. And that means that although they may make big promises about what drives can do, after not a huge amount of time, if you're constantly writing to the drive, it will all of a sudden hit a dip as the drive becomes oversaturated. And over-provisioning is one of those methods that's been utilised to get around this for as good as possible. Now, Samsung have built beyond this onto their own version known as TurboWrite, where they've created an area of extra storage on the drive, which forms an area of pseudo SLC write storage NAND that not only can ensure nice fast-acting write onto the drive, but in idle times and in the background, it will move that data onto the larger storage area inside, creating a much faster and longer sustained time period of write activity to the drive. Obviously, if you oversaturate that, you're going to have the same problem, but at the very least it means that long-term high-performance writes will go on for considerably longer on this drive than a number of other drives that either don't arrive with over-provisioning or use rudimentary over-provisioning on their drives. Overall, very impressive indeed. Next up, the Samsung Magician software that this drive arrives with. All of the drive manufacturers out there, your Seagates, your WDs, even your Toshibas, all arrive with their own tools that you can install on your Windows or Mac system that once you put it down there, allows you to access the drive and then perform software updates and a few rudimentary extras. But of all of the ones on the market, I think it's largely agreed that the best is Samsung's with their Samsung Magician software. Not only can it obviously feature in updating the firmware on your drive, but on top of that, you can utilize it for running very bespoke benchmarks, not just standard benchmarks, but you can actually change some of the collateral and testing performance methodology to that, spitting out not just standard transparent IOPS, but real world information that you can use. On On top of that, you can utilize it for comparative data versus other drives in your system. It's not just limited to Samsung's only drives, it can be used on all the other drives out there. On top of that, there is support on this drive of AES encryption, 256-bit encryption on the drive. Now that encryption is very important and managed by the Samsung Magician software. Why is that? Well, let's be straight, they're not the first people to produce a drive when you connect it to your system, it needs a password. That's actually quite old. The idea of having drives that either had a keypad that you patted in, or when you connected it, the case that it was in would then demand the system client software, operating system like Windows, to say, I need my password for you to gain access. That's not new. But this drive can encrypt the data inside. So the data on the drive is encrypted and password protected. That means, unlike that encryption being only case-based, this means that encryption is case and data-based. It means they can't just remove the NAND from the little PCB inside that's custom made for this and whop it in another case. It doesn't work that way. And I think, again, Samsung Magician is a part of how that is made possible. Overall, the software that this arrives with, and is completely free, is one of the best in the market. So you would end up with a drive that is very, very good to look at with some decent performance numbers and plug and play sustained performance, I might add, but also the best software to wrap around and manage it with. Next up, performance. Both the 1 and the 2 TB arrive with 2000 megabytes per second, or 2 gigabit or 2 gigabyte read performance there, and in terms of write performance, 1950 megabytes or 1.95 gigabytes performance there in terms of write activity onto this drive. And remember, with TurboWrite sustained. The 4 TB model, which is the one that I am holding, will allow you to have 2 gigabytes per second read and write onto the drive for a sustained period of time there. Ultimately, it means that you are getting a very, very fast external drive, which, whether you're going to be utilizing it for having your daily backups, or you're going to utilize it as an actual editing disk that you carry from system to system as you go on site to your office from your home, it's a very fast drive that is bus powered, so no additional power needed. Also worked across a myriad of different file platforms as well, and that includes connecting it, if you wish, to get your mobile phone, grab yourself the inclusive cable, if I can find it, taking said cable, grabbing the drive, connecting it into the base of the unit and then into your mobile phone. That's right. Whether you're going to be recording using your iPhone or your Android phone and then transferring that data easily and very quickly, I might add, onto your editing desktop or laptop computer, you can do that with simple plug and play. It will appear, disconnect it, or safely, I should say, from that system, and then go ahead and connect it into those other systems. This will work as a one-touch backup with the right software, and with Samsung having applications for mobile devices as well as the desktop tools that we just talked about, that 20 gigabits per second and compatibility across multiple devices is going to be hugely attractive to a lot of users. However, as good as those 4 things sound, there are things about this drive that may make you want to think again. So, alongside those 4 great reasons to go for the T9, let's talk about 4 reasons where you might want to sit on the fence a bit longer or give it a miss entirely.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. That is both something I like about this drive and I do not like about this drive. Now, cast your mind back to when USB 3 started kind of losing its head a little bit. USB 3 rolled out the gate and everyone rejoiced. It was 5 gigabits per second, we were all happy. And then after a while USB was working on USB 4, they decided to completely muck around with the naming convention, and doing so really changed USB 3 into USB 3.1 and USB 3.2. That eventually became USB 3.1 Gen 2 and USB 3.2 Gen 1. That eventually gave way to USB 3.2 Gen 1 and then USB 3.2 Gen 2. All of these ended up being referring to different conventions of USB in terms of naming, but also the capabilities and bandwidth of those USBs. And yes, I'm aware how confusing it was. You try making 2 videos about it 2 years ago. But with the USB compatibility, after all of those, they released a much faster version for users who either didn't have access to USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 due to hardware shortages and component shortages, or systems that didn't have certifications in licensing to take advantage of Intel's Thunderbolt 4 connectivity or USB 4, but could add a new kind of USB onto these more affordable motherboards. Again, your Asus, your ASRock, etc. That was USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. Wow, right? But that meant 20 gigabits per second, or that 2 gigabytes per second, that this drive is capable of. So why is it in the bad pile of points? Well, quite simply, USB 4 exists. Thunderbolt 4 exists. All of this exists. Right now, for a not dissimilar price to this in both 1, 2 and 4 TB, I might add, you've got several options open to you. And if you do want to use USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, you have to make sure your system has a compatible port. Otherwise, you'll be using legacy USB 3.2 Gen 1 or Gen 2, restricting you to 5 gigabits per second or 10 gigabits per second. If you don't have the specific port for this, or at least Thunderbolt 4 and or Thunderbolt USB 4 ports with true backwards compatibility to get that 20 gigabits per second, you are going to have a drive that isn't going to be able to deliver the big promises on its performance. I'm still finding it really strange that they went ahead with USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 for this drive released at the tail end of 2023. And there are so many different options out there in terms of buying a USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 drive. To put that into perspective, this is from Arico. This is their USB 4 drive here. This gives you 40 gigabits per second there. That's right, it isn't just saying you've got 40 gigabits of bandwidth and this drive will try to fill it. It's got PCIe Gen 3 SSD inside there that at the very least will give you 3,300 megs to 3.5 gigabytes per second there inside. On top of that, you've got external enclosures as well that will allow you to use third-party drives. More on that later on. Ultimately, what I'm saying is, my issue with utilising the connection in this is it feels weirdly dated at the tail end of 2023 when there are faster connections in the market right now that Samsung could have urged for. And when early leaks of this drive appeared online months before its initial release, lots of users just assumed it would be USB 4, assumed it would be Thunderbolt 4, because it seemed like a no-brainer. So it surprised a lot of people, myself included, that they didn't opt for that.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Next up, I want to talk a little bit about that TurboWrite system from Samsung on this drive. I do stand by what I said. It is very, very good and does allow for much better long-term sustained performance on a drive like this. But one thing I think Samsung could stand to be a little noisier about, because they do mention it in the TNC, they do mention it in the spec tables, but I do think they could stand to be a little louder, is when they talk about this drive arriving with 180 gigabytes of TurboWrite pseudo SLC storage, they don't really say at the exact same time that the 1TB and the 2TB models have less. Only the 4TB has 180 gig. The 1 and 2TB arrive with 22 gigabytes and 88 gigabytes respectively. These are still not small amounts of storage, and obviously they have to be relative to the main core storage space. But if you are utilising that 20 gigabits per second or 2 gigabytes per second connection with this to transfer data onto it, that 1TB drive running at 2 gigabytes per second is going to very quickly fill up that 22 gigabytes of TurboWrite storage on this, and that sustained period of write is not going to be the same sustained period of write that the 4TB would have enjoyed because of that 180 gig to play with there. It's a small difference, and I understand that these things again have to be scaled relative, much like the DRAM on an SSD scales in terms of the storage capacity, 1 gig, 1TB, 2 gig, 2TB, etc. But nevertheless, I just wish Samsung would be a little louder about the quantities of that TurboWrite on these drives.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Next up, let's talk about weatherproofing, because on this drive, I mentioned as my very first point, I really like the design, and I stand by that. This is very compact, it fits in your wallet, it's bus powered, it's protected from a 3-meter drop, and it doesn't even get as hot as you might think for a metal drive encased in silicon or plastic. And indeed, when you compare it against other SSDs in the market, such as the Lacy Orange drive or some of G-Tech's drives here, this is the hard drive, there is an SSD version, or even SanDisk's external SSDs like the Extreme Pro, a drive that frankly has been getting a real kicking recently because of the way Samsung handled that firmware. But nonetheless, all of these drives, this is still arguably the smallest. It's heavier than the SanDisk by 10 grams, but it's still the smallest overall between all of them. However, this drive, from what I can see online, is IP65 rated, whereas these two drives here are rated at IP66 and IP67 alongside the Lacy drive. What does that mean? That means that this drive is protected from light, moisture and dust ingress. It's still very well protected, and arguably I think it could probably withstand quite a decent amount of ingress. However, when it comes to ones like that Lacy and the G-Tech I mentioned, these being IP66 and 67, they can withstand substantially more in terms of moisture and waterfall as well as dust. Now, in some cases, it's because they use a completely closed system. Or, in some cases, like this one, all they've done is put a rubber fascia around the edge that is sealable over the one USB-C port on the top. But that can just be taken off. It is literally just a rubber cover. So, it just pains me to know that all Samsung would have had to do was to add a top to this, to cover that, to get that additional rating and ensure that this drive would be protected from a lot more of the water or dust ingress and thereby increase that IP rating. Sadly, that is not the case. So we have to at least highlight that this drive is not quite as weatherproof and general environmental proof in terms of moisture and dust as some of its competitors. It is very well protected, I would argue, in most other ways, particularly that drop testing, and it feels incredibly sturdy put together. But in terms of weatherproofing, and ingress proofing, it's not quite as good as some of the other ones out there.
Come on, that's just the way it is.
Finally, I want to circle back to a point I made earlier on regarding the price of this and what you can get for your money. Now, again, the price of the T9 at launch, it's not great. It's actually lower, arguably, than the price that we saw the T7 arrive first in the market, which is pretty impressive for the time that's passed. But still, at the end of 2023, it's quite expensive for a 1, 2 and 4 TB, although, of course, you're paying for the branding and the design of this casing. However, for that same money, there's actually quite a lot of options out there that provide you a similar or greater amount of capacity and performance. For example, rather than go for that, you could opt for the Samsung's own internal SSDs, the 970 or the 980 series, for example, in Gen 3 and Gen 4, and then go for an external casing. You could go ahead if you chose, for example, to go for this. This is the Orico, I believe it's £80 external M2 NVMe SSD case here, and this is a USB 4 connected 40 gigabit case. You can take that Samsung drive and install it inside that at a not dissimilar price point per terabyte compared with that. It costs a little bit more, but you're getting twice the capacity overall. But do bear in mind with that option, this doesn't have a fan, so it's silent, but it also doesn't have a fan, so it gets warm. This case gets real warm there. The whole case acts as a heatsink. This will not get as warm as that. So just bear in mind with that option, although you're making, a performance benefit in terms of that storage, you are making up for it with a drive that's a little clunky, a bit harder on the edges, different design entirely, which again is completely up to you whether you like that, but it will get warm. But there are other options in the market. For example, you could, again, go for an Eno here. This is an Eno external case SSD here. And again, this is by no means a small. It's at almost 3 times the weight as well, at 385 grams. And this SSD case here has an active cooling fan based into the top, and is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 case. That's right, £67 for this, and you can install one of Samsung's SSDs in here, or more importantly, go for a cheaper SSD to still get the same amount of performance possible in that drive. Now, bear in mind, this is a bigger drive, it's got an active cooling fan. I wouldn't argue it's as portable, but it's just another example of showing you that there are ways and means to get the same level of performance and capacity at the same, slightly more or slightly lower price point than that on the Samsung there. So, again, I do like the design, I do like the casing, and I like what Samsung have done here. But at the end of 2023, there are other options out there, and I'm just surprised, like a lot of users, that this has arrived with 3.2 Gen 2 X2 and not on a USB 4. And I think that may be to its detriment. But this has been our should you buy it before you buy it on the Samsung T9? What do you guys think? There's a link in the description to the full review and testing, as well as the written review as well. If you need further kind of support and not really know which drive you should be going for in your editing suite or personal backups, use the comments below, use the free advice section on the right hand side of the page on NAS Compares, the big blue button, the free community support forum at Ask NAS Compares, our Discord, or head over to Ko-Fi and Patreon for expedited support as well as access to videos and articles before everyone else. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, hope yourselves a great week, and I'll see you next time.